times.
let me put a theory to you that I've been thinking about actually for a number of years, and I'll tell you the story of how it sort of emerged for me. When I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, I had a chance to interview the fellow whose name escapes me, but he was then the EU ambassador, the European Commission's ambassador to Israel. And I said, why is it that we hear nonstop from the European Union that Israel has to end its occupation of the West Bank, of Gaza, but we never hear from the European Union that Syria has to end its occupation of Lebanon? Why is it that when 53 Palestinians are killed in Jenin, it is a major event in European politics, but when 50,000 people are killed in Darfur, it is a comparatively minor event? I offered a few instances of that. And he said something that stayed with me. He said, you see, you Israelis, including me as an Israeli, you Israelis, you're one of us. Our expectations are higher for you than they are for, say, Cambodians or Colombians. I remember being really very struck by the comment. First of all, the racism involved vis-a-vis Cambodians or Colombians, but I also thought what was telling about the comment was the idea that more is expected of Jews, which harks back to a comment that was once made, I think, by the philosopher Eric Hoffer, who said that Israelis are the only country on earth that is expected to behave like a Christian nation. Now, it seems to me that something is at play here which is actually quite ancient, and I'm wondering what your take on it is. Part of the reason why Christian anti-Semitism has been so sustained, so powerful, is that Christ offered his dispensation first to the Jews, and the Jews turned him down. So, I mean, it came later to to Europe and the rest of the world, but the Jews were the first ones who were given this gift, and they turned it down. Then, sort of moving ahead a couple of thousand years, there were these wonderful expectations put on Israel. You remember Jerusalem of gold, the kibbutzim movement, a kind of socialist paradise. And after 1967, Israel disappointed all of those expectations. It became more laissez-faire in its economic outlook. It took over the West Bank and Gaza. It got itself involved in sort of the muck and mire of geopolitics. So Israel sort of was given the opportunity to be different, and it disappointed those expectations. And in a way, that's a kind of parable of the fallen angel. That's to say, it's satanic in a sense. You don't really expect moral behavior from beasts. And if you think of, say, the Sudanese as beasts, well, you don't expect moral behavior. That's just sort of what the Sudanese do. They go and kill Darfuris, or they kill their southern citizens, and so on. But more is expected of the Jews. Now, is that, I mean, is that a crazy theory on my part?
No, I think you touch on something very important. And I would say for a strand of anti-Semitism always claims that, if only the Jews would, the world would be saved. So if only Israel changed, or if only Israel didn't exist, there'd be peace in the world. When religion was the way of seeing the world, the Christians used to argue, or the anti-Semitic Christians would argue, that only if the Jews would accept Christ, everything would be okay. When race and biology and nationalism became the way of seeing the world, the Europeans were fascinated by the fact that only if the Jews would be eradicated, eliminated, or removed, then everything would be okay. And I think now the strand is that if Israel would change, or if Israel disappears, then everything will be okay. And I think this is why it's so important for people for moderate Muslims and people in the West to really begin to understand the language of Islamicism, because the thing about anti-Semitism, and I think that the demonization of Israel and holding Israel to double standards is a form of anti-Semitism. I wrote on this very issue with Ed Kaplan, a colleague at Yale, and we showed unequivocally that there's a very profound link between traditional classical anti-Semitism and what we call Israel bashing. We don't call it anti-Zionism, but extraordinarily harsh criticism of Israel is very much linked to traditional anti-Semitism. In fact, we found that of the people that bashed Israel excessively, they were 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic than the average population in 10 European countries. So it's off the charts. So there is this belief that if only Israel changes, or only if Israel's gone, that everything will be okay. But the thing about anti-Semitism and Israel bashing is that anti-Semitism starts with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And Europe and nations in which got rid of its Jews always end up in dire straits, and other people, many other people, are often caught in this cancerous...
Could you say, just to interrupt you briefly,
sure.
Anti-Zionism starts with Zionists but never ends with Zionists?
Right. So to say...
Well,
yeah.
It ends with, from anti-Zionism,
Right.
you get anti-Semitism, and then you get...
Right. Right. So, and so the whole sort of notion of when this thing happened in Jenin, I remember watching CNN, and they were calling, Jenin was a Holocaust, literally. The Palestinian public spokesperson Arakat and others were calling it a Holocaust. It turned out that 53 people died. The vast majority of the people who died were combatants engaging with the IDF. There's this type of imagery. There's the Nazification of Israel that's occurring, and there's also Holocaust denial, which is rampant in the Middle East, and it's also re-emerging in Europe and other parts of the West. And in a sense, Holocaust denial is repugnant because it's almost it's committing another Holocaust on the memory of the Jewish people. So when Ahmadinejad and the Islamicists claim that the Jews are swindling money from the Europeans, from reparations, and this is just sort of a conspiracy to create the state of Israel, and that the Israelis and the Jews are swindling Europeans, this is just an eradication of the memory of the Jewish people, and using the Holocaust as a weapon to fight the state of Israel and the Jewish people. So it's a nasty form of anti-Semitism.
So, I mean,